Thanks, Kate. And thanks, everyone, for being here. There's a lot of familiar faces, so thank you for coming, especially my colleagues at the MCA. I appreciate it. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the exhibition Entre Horizontes, Art and Activism between Chicago and Puerto Rico, and then we're going to have a little dialogue. I have to say I'm really honored to be on stage with these two artists who are also close friends. I've known Omar for a very long time. He was in my first group exhibition back in San Juan, Puerto Rico, when I was an independent curator. And Candida was my first studio visit here in Chicago in 2019. I remember reaching out literally from your website and saying, I want to meet you. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here. Let me start the... So Entre Horizontes is an exhibition that really came out of a long research process, but also a call for proposals by the Terra Foundation for American Art and their Art Design Chicago initiative that was looking for projects that analyze the historic migrations that have constituted the city of Chicago. And at the time, I thought it would be a really great idea to propose an exhibition that was looking at not only Puerto Rican artists in Chicago, but Puerto Rican migration to Chicago. And before arriving in Chicago in 2019, I had several friends, part of my generation of artists and curators, who had come to Chicago to study at the Art Institute, curators and artists. And I also knew that Chicago had a very important community that was very activist, that had self-organized. So that was very known back in the island. But also knowing that the main narrative around Puerto Rican migration was always New York. So it was an exhibition, an opportunity to really highlight those histories and really bring together both those artistic genealogies and those social movements. So the exhibition's title, Entre Horizontes, is trying to do just that. So it's trying to use the horizon line, it's between horizons, as a metaphor to think about what it is to feel, think, and work between two different places, between two horizons, between two different cultures, two different languages, etc. But also when I came to Chicago and I was speaking to the artists, and Omar, we had that conversation early on. We had like a 5-hour studio visit, I remember. It was a pretty intense conversation of how you always came back to the horizon line over Lake Michigan as this image that reminded you of home. And of course, it's not the same as the Caribbean, we all know that. But there's something about the city by the lake that brings this sense of belonging for people coming from, an island like ourselves. And then I started finding more and more other artists telling me about this horizon line, and also finding that Arnaldo Roche used to go, who's a Puerto Rican artist who went to the Art Institute in the 80s, used to go to Lakeshore to draw there. So there were all these different connections between these artists. And I thought that title really captured this really two different histories coming together here in the city. And also something that for me was really important was that when I arrived to the MCA, and I didn't know this before, the MCA has the largest public collection of works by Rafael Ferrer, a very important artist that has been incredibly influential to artists like Omar Velázquez. And this work right here that you see, it's right at the entrance. The show closes May 5th. So if you haven't seen it, please pass by the MCA. And this is a work that greets visitors right before coming in, a mural that was done at the old building of the MCA in 1972. So in conversation with Rafi, we recreated this mural, Museo, right? That for me was so interesting because as the MCA transitioned not that long ago into a bilingual English-Spanish institution, there was already that word of museo, right, in 1972. But also thinking about how it was a type of Puerto Rican occupation, I kind of define it in that way. So it's a museum within a museum, or a museo within a museum. And I'll just click through images so we can get to the dialogue, but there a group of artists, right, that are thinking about social and political issues, but also several generations of painters, including Omar and Candida, who are thinking about printmaking or that have a printmaking sensibility. And here you can see Arnaldo Roche, Angel Otero, again, artists that have been influential to each other, that have known each other, that have met. For example, Candida was Omar's first year advisor at the Art Institute. There's a lot of different connections between different generations of artists. But also, as part of the show, there's a whole archival section that is really telling the story of Puerto Rican migration, Puerto Rican self-actualization, but also the political and social oppression of the Puerto Rican community. And for me, it was really important to include this archival material because a lot of folks, even myself, I'm like, how did the Puerto Rican community arrive to Chicago? There was a lot of questions around that. And the story that I started to read through the research was that Puerto Ricans were recruited by a temp agency to come to Chicago to be cheap labor, basically. So men to work in the foundries and the steel mills, and then women as domestic workers as part of the Chicago experiment. That was a project as part of the modernization of Puerto Rico. So there was a very political kind of background to all of these different migrations, and also thinking about how to tell these stories in a way that was, respectful, that was in dialogue with the community. So part of all of this information has to do with thinking about those archival materials, not only institutional, but also materials from personal archives of community members that we met along the way. And here you see a bit of that material. And here at the left, you see Omar's painting. I'll keep clicking. Now we can get to Omar's work. So that's kind of like a really abbreviated overview of the exhibition. But what I want to kind of start off is talking to both of you of how we met, about your practice, how you see printmaking in your work. And I want to start with Omar because Omar, again, was in a first group exhibition that I did back in 2011 with a work called Patches. Yeah. And right there. It's right here. I'll click it. But I want to say that I know Omar as a printmaker, not a painter. So when I moved here in 2019, and at the time Michael Darling had said, there's a great show by Omar Velázquez at Corbett at Dempsey. And I went to see the show and I was just so taken aback. It was all painting, a bit of sculpture, but all painting. But this is the work that we showed at the exhibition. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, at that time, I was trying to explore a little bit more the painting aspect of printmaking. And my background, it was completely black and white. I was learning the history of Puerto Rico in black and white, like learning all the masters of the 50s and 60s, printmaking, Carlos Raquel Rivera, Lorenzo Omar, and it was really strong material. But I was kind of tired of like the same imagery, and I was also kind of the type of work that I was doing at that time. It was very human. I was doing a lot of portraits of like people from the streets and stuff like that, and walking that same path of like using the street as a like the main theme in my work at that time. I did this work. This is a clip from a video of and basically I call it Patches because I select a bunch of places at that time that was like the main avenue in Puerto Rico, which at some point was like very lush, in economy. And at that time, it was the period of like the economy was like declining, and there was a lot of abandoned spaces. And I select these specific spaces that had like panels to had been vandalized or to prevent vandalism from looters or whatever. So it became very interesting for me as a matrix to how can I take this part of the street and kind of take it and put it in another space. So I select these spaces and I start inking these panels and then printing them on site and bringing those prints back to the gallery. And at that time, Carla had a specific exhibition called
The dialectic city.
Dialectic Cities, yeah. And it was kind of, perfect for that. It was kind of a specific project for a specific show, but then it was for me like an opening essay to the color possibilities, abstraction, and some things that I never thought about that I was into it. And after that, I got more interested in the painting world and stuff like that. But the funny thing about this video is like we show the video plus we show the prints on the gallery, um, and you can hear that time there was a protest, like a big protest on the street, and you can hear like "Nuestra vida ha sido dura," and those are things that I did not plan it, and it was the rawness of the video was part of the rawness, of like what was happening at that time, like part of the economic history of the island, that, and for me it was very important, even though that I feel like, it's not like, a project that I feel like, oh my God, it's one of my best works, but I feel like it was very raw, punk rock, street related, and and I have fun, so and I have a little bit of less hair.
Yes, we're all younger back then.
Yeah.
How do you relate this work to your current painting practice? Because once you moved to Chicago at the Art Institute and you met professors like Candida, can you, and maybe I'll bring Candida into that just to comment on it, because you've mentored so many generations of Puerto Rican artists in general, but also Puerto Rican artists. How was that move to Chicago influential to you, and how was like the painting department influential to your work once you were finding yourself here in Chicago as a printmaker?
Well, first of all, I think the main thing that was very attractive to the thing was the landscape. I always been kind of into landscape. And I think when I got to Chicago, I had an idea of like something that I left behind, and you mentioned it, the horizon. The horizon became something that was kind of like a ground, a settled ground. So at that time, when I got to Chicago, school, it's always, it's conflicted. You feel like you broke into pieces, and then you got to put yourself together back again, and I met Candida at that time, and I was kind of lost, like I don't know what I'm doing, But that's one of the main things. Like it's so important to find yourself in a broken state, So, and Candida told me something that I never forget to this day. He said, "Omar, you're too mercurial, It's like you're moody. You're a moody guy, So my work became something related to how I was interacting with spaces and my relationship with the space, and obviously those works were like related to the space that I was transiting all the time. But once I got to Chicago, it was like a moment of I have to settle down, walk the city, learn the city, learn the history of painting in Chicago, the history of like painting at all, because I was like walking in this like curtain of smoke that I didn't know much about it, but I have like a urge of knowing. It's funny because one of my other main interested was in the printmaking department in the SAIC, but I choose to walk the other way, and I want to try to learn something that I feel like I'm not so comfortable. So painting for me at that time it was a struggle, but it was until I left school that I kind of find like more like a way to approach painting in a different way. But I think if you, we have some other images of like early work that I did.
No, this is Rafi's.
Well, this is a painting of Rafi. Okay, so when Carla started addressing the idea for the show, and I met Carla here in Chicago. I think you were like recently getting here, and I saw, I got a show, Corbett versus Dempsey. You should check it out. I want to say hi. It's been a while. I haven't seen you. So in our discussion, we start visiting. You visit my studio, and thinking about, at that time I was doing a lot of landscape inspired kind of work, but more like in a very nostalgic way. I was looking through like these imagined landscapes and colors and stuff like that. And I was drawn by the idea and the paintings of Rafi. And because I was recently, even though that I knew his work for a while, I was recently discovering his world. And that painting in particular, when I did the show at the MCA, the Chicago Works,
In 2020.
2020, it was a very a weird moment because you got the pandemic happening. I thought that the project was not going to happen. At that time, I was here doing those things, and it was a conflicted moment. So I moved to the island, thinking of a place to find, like that inner peace. And that painting put me in that kind of a, I want to find this place. So I went down to a friend to the, jump in a boat at 5 a.m. in the morning. And this guy showed me around, and we see the coast and all that stuff, and things happening. I remember that time we were, in that boat at 5 a.m. in the morning, and I saw this giant turtle coming up the water, and it was kind of like a magical, presence of something that was telling me, "Don't worry, man, it's gonna be fine. Welcome home." So it was a very welcoming, experience, and our generation turns to looking through our phone. I want to record that moment, but no, So I was like, I want to have this moment for forever. So if you click the painting, basically I did the painting after, but it was like that giant turtle that is like coming off the water, and it has like a two-face, it's kind of a monster too. And I like the idea of like turning the landscape into a more surreal kind of space, And but yeah, I think that's more or less how I react to the space. It's sometimes you don't plan it, and sometimes it's just like something that happened, and but you know, you know.
Candida, I want to turn to you. I would like for you to start with your arrival story here to Chicago. I know it's been a while. I mean, you are a Chicagoan right now, but I want you to maybe talk a little bit about, your arrival here, how you found the school, and a little bit about, your role as a professor to so many artists.
How much time do we have? 1998. How do I start? Well, first I want to say that I love your title, Entre Horizontes. Right? Is that right? I'm saying
Yes.
it right. Because for me, growing up in New York, and I faced the East River, so it was more like the East River for me. But it was also in between the teaching, it was a window for an opportunity to pause and to sort of, just unfold. And so it was peace for me, looking out that window. We have some of the best views towards that lake. So for me, that's one of the most important things that I remember, coming to the school and realizing that we were so close to the lake. It was a beautiful place to work, and then to be asked to come and to go through this whole selection process to become, to be hired, right? As I, one of the first, I think Latina professors in painting. And I also was a dean for 2 years. I was never chair, but to have this wealth of students. I mean, one of my first students was Edra Soto, my first graduate student. So, and then there was an undergrad, Steve Cordero from Chicago. So I was really happy. I was like, oh, Edra's from Puerto Rico, and Steve is from Chicago. So, as a Puerto Rican that was born in New York, my relation to Puerto Rico was different, right? But it was so embedded in who I was, that I've had friends who were born and raised in Puerto Rico say that I'm more Puerto Rican than they are. I thought that was cool, you know. But my mother and father were very insistent on us being, learning what that was, right? And so to be a professor at the school was a big deal. It was like, wow, okay, painting department. All right, here I am. And to be there for 20 years and now be officially emeriti, I don't even know how to say it. That's a new protest. It's not emeritus or emerita, it's emeriti, right? So I'm really proud. And to have met Omar and Edra and Angel Otero and oh my God, there's so many, so many. It's a real gift, right? To sort of feel the island through them too, and to have these conversations that go in many different directions, right? So we talk about, what's happening contemporary wise, this whole relationship to what practices, how do you feel comfort in the things that you're good at, right? How do you sort of push past something that you think you should be aiming for? And so I think the sense of comfort in something that is more familiar, like culture, right, is an interesting way. Isn't it? It's an opening for a conversation, really, and for trusting, right? And I never knew what that experience was going to evolve into, taking on the charge of being a professor at the school. But I really, for me as an artist, it gave me, I love the conversations that took place. And listening was a big part of what I did, right? And encouraging and sort of getting to something that maybe was lurking but wasn't visible yet, right? So I just think it's been an amazing journey. And, I never could have predicted it. And so, um, So I'm gazing at the cockfight.
Yes, I'm putting this here because I have to say that part of the argument of the show is that Puerto Rican artists have like a graphic, a printmaking consciousness, and printmaking as a medium is very important for the emergence of contemporary art on the island. So, you started off as a printmaker, now you're a painter, and you do have utilize you still do printmaking. That's
Yeah.
true. That's true. And Candida, you're a painter, but I've shown a couple of your prints, and once we started talking, you were really excited to talk about the prints that you did in the 90s and throughout your career. And even the painting that we have in the show does have a type of like graphic quality to it that recalls like silk screen printing, like the hard edge lines of screen printing, for example. So can you talk a little bit about your connections and your experience with printmaking and how you see perhaps mechanical reproduction in your work, in your painting process?
Okay. This cockfight print is from 1976. So I wanted to pick an early print. And this was more an imagined space because I think I'm trying to remember the first time I went to Puerto Rico. I went on a trip, right? And I must have seen a cockfight or something. We always heard about them. And so they're so fantastic, I mean, in a way. And I was just like blown away. And so one of the first things the image that I wanted to work with was on a lithographic stone, right? It was a stone. I mean, it was heavy, but I picked a small one. And I was actually at Museo del Barrio working on this. And Bill Tulis, who was an amazing printmaker who taught, where did he teach? At Pratt. He was at Pratt. And and he was teaching the class. And so I was at Fordham University. I was studying painting with Jack Whitten. I didn't know I was going to be an artist. I mean, I didn't really know what that was, right? I was taking art classes, and then as I was sort of going, I was almost out of there. I mean, I graduated in 1977. I took the train up to El Barrio, right? And so I loved it. It was great working on that stone. And there's something about the skills that go into doing this kind of work, right? There's a kind of level of attention and I like the collaborative spirit in the room. Like you don't do it by yourself, right? Painting for me is solitary, and printmaking is more about us, together. And I like, the idea of multiples, the idea that, it's the pages of a book, I mean, there's something about the history of printmaking, the idea that it's accessible, the fact that, there's prints hanging up on the wall, like you can buy a print, it's cheaper than a painting, right? I mean, there's something about that medium that I think is particular. And I learned a lot, I mean, early on about, Lorenzo Omar. I even got to go to his studio. I was this very young artist, and I was just blown away by the look of it, the way it just, I wanted to keep staring at it. It was bold, it was declarative, it had a message. And so I just tried the best I could. So this is 1979, and I was working from photography, and it's another kind of print, right? I love photography. One of the first tools I ever bought and spent money on was a camera, and so I just love anything that you just you get this image and you can multiply it in some way. And so this was really hard to. I mean, the etchings. They're really hard to do. They take a lot of effort, right? I mean, just getting the plate just right, it's a lot of labor. And so, yeah. This one. And so this is an offset litho. So here I had somebody else doing the work. I mean, I made the drawing on the litho plate, which was very light, right? But then we built with all these colors, and so there was a big machine. So it was a whole different kind of contraption. But this is interesting, it's like in the images, which were more narrative, this idea of sort of connecting to the island was very important, right? The pictures of my parents, the memories that they conveyed in the photographs, and that's how I learned about my family, right? The family in the island was through the pictures, right? So they were very important to me, and I used them in the work, and you
still use them.
I still use them. Yeah, I still use that iPhone. I love it. But and then it moved from like this space. And this was another kind of offset. It was done at Derriere Latoile Studios in New York. But this is a different kind of printing. They have all different techniques, and I can't really say I'm a printmaker. I would have to say that I use it as a tool. And I love participating in it. And this one ended up in the Whitney Museum, which was really pretty amazing. It was part of a portfolio that was produced in New York. And there's my hand, sometimes I embed myself in the work. So there's my handprint, and there were little pieces of paper that kind of, for me, was really building a structure that was like the building that I lived in, the projects in Brooklyn. So I wanted to bring a sense of place. It's always in the work somehow. There's always a beginning point, which is usually a story that I'm trying to say, but then it gets kind of dismantled and becomes the thing that it wants to become. And so, so I find printmaking, invaluable, and I like to do it periodically. It's like a break. Yeah.
I'm wondering if this is for both of you. How do you see printmaking making itself visible in your painting practice? And I know that you don't consider yourself a printmaker, a painter, but I'm wondering if that experience and the workshops that you took somehow end up in your paintings, in the process of making your paintings. And for Omar, just also thinking about your trajectory and how there's slippage between your printmaking practice and your painting practice.
In my case, I tend to at the beginning, I felt like I'm not good with colors, so I tend to go back to the old Divetco seal screens, looking for palettes, and in how I construct my paintings now. For example, I tend to do layers, thinking about I build my painting as a seal screen, basically, and also. For each image that I do in terms of shapes, I tend to do stencils too. So the stencil making, I turn to keep them. I do not trash the stencil, even though that I use the ones. So I have a collection of all these stencils that I might use it in a. So the multiple the image the thinking about like I'm gonna repeat this image and use another context for the image. That's a very pre-making kind of idea. So it's a practice that makes you like tend to the multiple. So I think I kept that from making pre-making. So
Candida?
I would say that thinking about how one layers, right? I think that was something that probably printmaking gave me, right? It's like how to think something through because you have to plan it out, and there's a series of steps. Um, and so I think when I like for my paintings, I start with photographs. I make copies of the photographs. I make more copies. I use them like shapes, right? And then they kind of get all mixed up, and then and then it becomes this pencil drawing, and then it becomes then the painting starts to come from that. So there's several stages, right? And so it gets built up. And so I think that permission to allow oneself to not just do it all at once, right? To do it in steps is probably something that could potentially be from these actions that one learns, in developing. We learn our skills, right? And those things get embedded in other things. It gives you permissions, right? Like, oh, I could do this way, or I could reveal some of this, I could reveal some of the pencil, or I could, it just gives you permissions, knowing the mediums.
So we have here an installation image of the show where we can see your painting to the right, Licking a Red Rose, that is part of the MCA collection. And we had a wonderful conversation about this painting and also its title. And I'm wondering if you could share that with the audience.
Licking a Red Rose really refers to this amazing artist, Buford Delaney, who I met because of the CETA Artist Project in the 80s. And we went to his studio at Union Square. Well, actually, I was in the middle of painting this painting, and there's a lot of red and blues, right? It was also, the election was coming up, and I remember I never thought about color any another way than just, just being the color. I didn't think about it politically, right? I mean, in that way. So, but because it was it was the Democrat or Republicans, right? And there was a moment when I said, "Oh, how much red do I have in this painting?" Right? It was just like a really funny idea that kind of went through. I was like, wait a minute, I have to make sure the balance is like a little off here. But it was a funny thought. And then at the same time, I was going through it, and I was also looking at Picasso's Three Musicians, the Three Magicians. I'm sorry, the Three Magicians. And so that's been lurking in my head for a long time. So this is also, it kind of riffs off that painting as well. But it's this shape thing. It's around an assembly. And, so as I was finishing the painting, all of a sudden I had this vision of this artist licking a red rose. And I kept thinking, did I remember that right? Was that really happening? And so I called my a dear friend, and I said, who was there with me? And I said, did this really happen? And he said, yeah, it really did happen. Buford was really licking that red rose. And I mean, Joseph, Buford is his brother, Joseph Dilling. Joseph was really licking that red rose. And so it just had to be the title of the painting because it was such a bizarre memory, because I had given him this rose because we went to his studio and I just was congratulating him on his show that just opened up. And so I brought him the rose and he started licking it. But he was already like in his 80s. He was older, right? It was very sweet but weird. And I just never forgot it. And there it is. It just comes back to you, this fleeting thought like, oh, let me just be the title for this painting.
Yeah, I was always kind of amused by that, like how you choose your titles, because there's so much content in your work. But I mean, you're an abstract painter, but there's a lot of content in your work. And to that end, kind of closing up our questions so we can open it up for discussion. The show's really thinking about, Chicago, Puerto Rico, and place and representation. I've always kind of challenged that, at the same time addressed it. And I'm wondering if you could both talk a little bit about how do you see Puerto Rico present in your work? If not representationally, like how do you see the experience of being Puerto Rican or the experience of migration in your work, or of going back and forth, for example, for you, Omar, but also for you as a Puerto Rican born and bred in New York that now lives in Chicago?
It's like cha-cha-cha. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So, right? Experience is a thread, it's, the flavor of Puerto Rico, right? I don't know. It's just in me, right? It's who I am, right? And I just feel like culture is something that lives. And that's why I use color, because it lives. And yes, there's a lot of context and ways of different strategies that I employ in my work. And I think it's that, it's just like, es como un sofrito, it's like you have all those vegetables in there, you let it cook enough, and then it just gets delicious, right? So I just feel the freedom to move. I think this idea of moving, because I move around a lot, and I like that. There's something about traveling and, missing something and recollection. I think that comes from the fact that I was in New York and Brooklyn, and my mother would always be recollecting. And so that became very important to me. So that idea of a storyteller, or that idea of finding the bits and pieces that add up to something that is very meaningful, right? So I feel like all of life is like that. For me, color is living, and abstraction is a representation of that. I think all of life is an abstraction. So I don't really believe in the calcifications that we kind of are trained to believe in. I just feel like the more open you are to who you are, and to trust the processes that you feel effective, like you build those things up for yourself, right? You just have to trust them. And I just trust them. And I think it's a way of being spontaneous and being in the moment, right? I'm from New York. We walk fast, we dance fast, we speak fast. There's like vitality that's very different than being on an island, right? But I just love that I sense the island because of my parents, who were it was so important to them. And it was so important to them that they realized that we had that, and I think it's just, it's just always that feeling of just being connected to something that is a land, like there's a landscape. And so now I live in Michigan too. And so when I look out that window sometimes, I think of Puerto Rico, and I thought, wow, my father, all those trees, and, there were coconut trees, but I have other kinds of trees. But there's maybe something in my cellular body that says landscape, it could be Puerto Rico, and it could be New York, right? And it could be any other place, but it's that the ability to adapt and survive, right? And to enjoy it.
It's funny because in my case, sometimes it becomes more like I see a lot of tension, even though that I was born and raised in the island, and but every time I'm so funny thing is like recently I start making a lot of birds in my paintings, and it was like, oh, why? And so I came back to the idea of like when I was starting to doing a lot of birds in my painting, I was thinking about migration and a way to how can I represent something in a poetic way, talking about migration. And I'm terrified of flying, So there's nothing more that puts me in a lot of tension that jump into a plane. So I try to, put that tension in the paintings all the time. It's like, oh, how can I make this painting very, feel like tension, but also beautiful, because I think about like being in Puerto Rico is something beautiful, but we live in a constant, tension of something's about to happen. You got to be ready for something, so that sense of like, we better get ready for something. I hate it, but I kind of love it because it makes me, when it comes to making an object or making a painting or whatever, it's about solving a problem, and you're always thinking about like, how can I solve? So Chicago became something that it was like getting away from a toxic relationship. I had a toxic relationship with my homeland, but I need it, but I kind of hate it, at some time. And it's weird, and some people expect like you coming from an island, you always dress all, colorful and having this and love reggaeton, and I'm always the opposite, I'm like, I'm a metalhead. I hate reggaeton, so I'm not
So
a beach.
weird.
I'm not a beach person. So that contradiction always, I have to live with it, and I love that meeting artists through time, learning about the diagonal. For example, I met this graphic artist Nelson Sambolin. At that time, I was working for him, and he showed me the importance of making stuff in diagonal. And the diagonal was like a representation of like how create instability, so things like that. Every time I do a painting, I put a bird dancing in a weird position, having like a weird pose. I feel like that sometimes. So I don't know, it's kind of a love-hate relationship,
I can see that in your colorful paintings in relation to the tension and the sort of doomsday content that they have sometimes. So thank you both. That was amazing. I think now we can open it up for questions from the audience.